John Hendrix here of States News Network, joined by two very special guests today. Nick Esayian from Light, who's going to talk a little bit about some new helmets that are coming up, and Dr. David, a sports orthopedic surgeon who has a wealth of knowledge, actually a guy that used to be in New Orleans, so I'm going to have him share about it. Gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Fabulous,
Great.
fabulous.
Thanks John.
For having
yes.
us.
Definitely. So, Nick, I'm going to tee this up to you first. So, obviously, a big announcement made today. Light partnering with the NFL, talking about special helmets, the Gladiator type of brand, and the New Orleans Saints are going to be one of 14 teams to kind of talk about it. So, look, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about Light and how this all came together and where things are at right now.
Sure. You know, the health and safety space certainly has had the spotlight shown upon it over the last decade or so. And the NFL, as well as a variety of other organizations, have been, trying to crack the code on, what's the best helmet? What's the best product? What are the best materials and technology? And they've done a good job. But the challenge is, even after, the 2022 season, we saw concussions in the NFL up 18%. And Light took the philosophy from auto racing, from the military, to be able to take those materials, apply them to the football field and other sports soon to be. And not only the materials being a bit different to spread impact out, absorb impact, but to reduce the weight of the helmet, reduce kinetic energy of secondary impacts or head to ground impacts. Like we all saw the scary Tua impact last year where he got pushed back. It wasn't that big of an impact and hit his head on the ground. And, if you think about a 1 pound carpenter's hammer versus a 2 pound carpenter's hammer, there's a lot more energy when you strike the nail with the 2 pound carpenter's hammer. So the goal was to reduce the weight, but continue to protect the player. And we found a way to do that. The NFL's been testing helmets for about a decade now. And we've seen that trend get of bigger and heavier helmets performing better in the lab, but not necessarily performing better on field. And with the NFL's help and a partner in Canada called Collide that makes these nifty 3D parts, we coalesced their components with ours, and in a relatively short period of time, aced the NFL test. That Gladiator's in the best category of highly recommended helmets, and it's the Players Association as well. I want to include them. And we put the helmet for sale after it was approved about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we've got 14 teams that have ordered them, and players are starting to wear them. We're starting to get the pictures, and it's exciting stuff.
Awesome. And so just following up on that, so on the Saints, obviously one team, is it one of those things where it's kind of like up to the player to decide if they're going to use it? Or is it something that, hey, as a team, we're probably going to make sure everybody uses this, based off our history, concussions or anything like that?
That's a great question. So at all levels of play, it's a little different. But in the NFL has a very formal process for helmets to go through a screening, impact protection, that they pass some other tests, that the quality is there in terms of how the helmets are manufactured, that they operate consistently at different temperatures and things like that, that they can accommodate the coach to player communication. And once that's done, each team has an equipment manager that builds relationships with the various companies. Right now, there are 4 football helmet companies, and those helmets are brought into the locker room, and then players are given the opportunity to make a choice. Some players, like an Aaron Rodgers, he's wearing the same helmet he wore from, back in the day. It's an old shot helmet, right? And he was even an investor in another helmet company, and he didn't wear those helmets. We actually ended up getting connected with the Saints via John Carney. My son, who we talked briefly about before the show, is a guard at Cathedral Catholic. He's a high school guard, but he wanted to take his hand at long snapping, knowing that maybe he doesn't get to be 6'6" and play in the NFL. So he went to a local camp, and John Carney was running the program. And we talked to John about Light helmets. He was enthusiastic about it. Obviously, he played on the Chargers, near and dear to Tal's heart, and the Saints, near and dear to your heart. And he made a couple of calls, and lo and behold, the Saints move forward. And we're not sure which players or how many players will end up wearing it, but we know it's in the locker room. And the fact that it's lighter by almost 2 pounds, depending on how it's configured, gives a player a big advantage, as well as the safety optimization.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. And Dr. David, so one of the things, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but Taysom Hill had a really scary concussion in 2021. He was playing against Washington, and he said there was a 45-minute gap where he couldn't remember anything. Just kind of talk about the concussion, like for those who don't actually know maybe about what happens when a concussion happens. This, we've seen it over the years. Some of the players have gotten hurt, like Chris Olave. It's a big deal, and NFL player safety is top of mind. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
I think that you bring up a good point, because concussions are not all the same. And I think the definition of what a concussion is has really changed, at least since, my first year covering the NFL in 2002, where you had to be either knocked out or you had to, have a episode of loss of consciousness to be considered a concussion. These days, we know that concussions can occur with sometimes it can be what appears to be relatively minor trauma. It's not always that violent head against the field that you see with some recent quarterbacks. But I think the key is that we understand what a concussion is. We recognize it. That's one of the reasons that you've seen more concussions, since 2018 in the NFL, is because the definition of a concussion has become a little bit more stringent. You also have guys that we often say, well, better to catch a few mild or even absent concussions than to miss one, and you want to protect these players. So I think the it's not always the highlight. Most of the time, when a guy comes off the field and he has a concussion, the cameras didn't see it, and the game didn't stop. He's comes off and has some complaints, and sometimes it's violent, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, and it was interesting because the Saints just played the Chargers, and Jake Hayner, with their rookie quarterback from Fresno State, he took a big hit to the head, and he was in there, and then they stopped it and said, look, you got to go get checked out. And so you get those doctors. We see a lot of the guys on the sideline with the red hats and everything that kind of check it out. But with this particular helmet and such, with the lighter weight, because I think one of the things that I was reading is that heavier helmets is talking about force, that kind of equation. Maybe just shed a little bit of light how the light helmets are going to actually help reduce, or to help impact the probability of a concussion.
Well, it's a matter of you can't ever get rid of concussions in a
right.
contact sport, whether it's
sure.
football, rugby, or you're not going to get rid of concussions. So you can basically look at what are the modifiable risk factors. The first one being rule changes, and we've seen that, whether it's body checking in hockey or it's targeting or helmet-to-helmet contact in football. And then the other modifiable piece is equipment. And I think that, it's funny, Nick can speak to this probably better than most about how there really hasn't been a big evolution in the football helmet in several decades. And now we're starting to understand how important it is. So, the concept is you're trying to protect the egg yolk within a casing, and the brain is. A colleague of mine alluded to it once. I thought this made a lot of sense. For lay people, the brain isn't what you see when you watch Young Frankenstein, and it's like this piece of plastic. It's actually the consistency of soft tofu, and it's actually, you shake it, and it's very sensitive to those kinds of things. So you're dealing with kind of an egg yolk floating in an egg white, and how do you protect all of the impact that can occur when you shake that whole construct? And so the helmet basically allows you to, you have an outer shell that absorbs the impact, and you have an inner shell that distributes it. And so the technology that Light now has, in conjunction with the Collide, I think is extremely unique. And the weight part just makes sense, right? If you tie a brick to your head, it's not going to be as protective just because there's a weight point to it. You're putting more stress on the neck. And the whole idea is the ideal helmet is a giant marshmallow on your head. It's light and it absorbs material. So how do you recreate that? And I think that's where the secret sauce is.
And just a follow-up question for concussions. So if somebody has a concussion in NFL or just in general, is their risk increased to have another concussion? Is that something that's common? Because I think we've seen players retire because of concussions, like a history of that. Maybe expound on that a little bit.
Yeah,
everybody's different. But
yeah, I think the history. Yes, the quick answer is if you've had one concussion, you're now potentially at risk of your next concussion. And it doesn't have to be, the severity isn't really as important as we used to think, as much as the frequency of concussions that you get. So the key is to prevent, the first injury is when the concussion occurs. The key is to prevent that second impact or that second insult where you injure or you re-aggravate, traumatize a brain that hasn't fully recovered from the first concussion. And that's where the problem is. So the key now is to if you can minimize the number of concussions, and if you happen to be in a category where you're getting multiple concussions, the further apart they are, generally speaking, the better. But yes, when we see free agents and we sign them and they've got a history where they've had a bunch of concussions in the past, that's usually a red flag.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. Now, Nick, I guess got to ask, you're CEO of Light. Just briefly talk about, or not even briefly, just expound on why do this? What made you so passionate about doing this for helmets and kind of the drive that you've had for it?
Sure. Football as a young man made a huge difference in my life. And, it's agnostic of race, color, religion. When it's 3rd and 8, nobody cares, right? You walk up and the goal is to pick up those 8 yards and you work together as a team. And, in today's society, in some cases, there's not a winner, there's not a loser. And we struggle at working together. We also struggle at dealing with loss. And the great thing about football is it puts you in a situation under pressure with your buddies that you've worked hard with. And you go out and you accomplish a small goal, which leads to the next goal and the next goal and the next goal. That's the beauty of football. The component that we wanted to deal with was to allow more people to play and reduce the perception that, hey, this is a sport that you're going to get hurt. As Tal said, we're never going to completely eliminate concussions from these, collision sports, but we can provide a level of confidence. We can provide the best product available. No helmet has ever had as much money spent on it as the modern day combat helmet for the United States. And we basically deconstructed that helmet with the different layers of foams and materials. We optimized utilizing some 3D printed parts from our partner Clyde, some help from the NFL to put together what we feel is the best sports helmet. And think about this. If the helmet that we sell is 2 pounds less than a competitive helmet, in an 80G impact, that 2 pounds becomes 160 pounds. And your cervical structure is managing that. And it's also shaking the yoke around that's in your head. So helmets have to look cool. I think we check that box. They have to fit well. They have to protect the player. But the other thing is players want to improve performance. And a few years ago, Tal can speak to this, players were cutting shoulder pad edges off, pulling thigh pads out, hip pads, knee pads. So if I can take 2 pounds off the worst part of the body, if you have an NCAA roster, or let's use an NFL roster, 53 players, I think is the number now, 2 pounds, that's 106 pounds if my math is right. There's not a single coach on the face of the planet that would say, carry these 2 45-pound weight plates and another 10 around in the Texas heat or the Louisiana humidity. They're not going to do it. So we're checking those boxes. And just by being on the field, it's going to force the competition to look at weight. The NFLPA has been looking at weight. We know that in youth sports, NOXI, who approves all these helmets for play, has a new standard for 3.5 pounds for younger players. We know that products like the Iron Neck have been utilized to strengthen the neck muscles, which also reduce the chance or severity of concussion. And by reducing weight of the helmet, we're doing the same thing.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Drew Brees came on as a partner and he's actually doing something in youth football with it. Is that correct?
So Drew Brees was a partner of ours for several years, and more so in the flag football space and the tackle space. He's got an extremely successful league, Friday FNA, Football in America, based in San Diego. He's got leagues across the country. They made it available to their players at a discount, and we're seeing a greater permeation of these headgear because they're looking at flag football as an Olympic sport. It's a high school sport in California. It's a high school sport in New York and Arizona. And it allows kids to play at a younger age when they're less developed, learn the game, albeit a little bit different of a game, but they get to participate in something that they get to see on Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. Drew's league's done a great job of making flag football available in an organized and a safe structure. And we were thrilled to, have him as a partner for those few years.
Definitely. And Dr. David, just a quick one, and I'm going to give you the floor to talk about anything else you want to. But speaking of kids, this is a physical sport, very demanding. If I was 10, 12 and getting a concussion and I'm in that growth, what does that do to my body? And versus now when I'm, say, 25 and still have maybe 5 years left in my career to play, is there a big difference there? Or is it just kind of like where you're talking about with the yolk in the brain?
Well, yeah, I think there is a difference. I know that there's a higher incidence with youth concussions. There's a higher incidence of mental health problems later, most commonly depression. So with mental health being such a big part of society, and it's becoming a societal discussion point. We're not afraid to talk about it, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So yes, the kids in particular, whether it's a broken bone or it's a head injury, the more we can protect them, the better. The later in life they can start to develop some of those problems, the longer their careers can be. So I personally think that that there probably needs to be more stringent rules and equipment changes, particularly in the youth athletes, Pop Warner included. So generally speaking, just like a lot of other things in medicine, prevention is key. Once you start going down a path, there can be other problems. But if we can get ahead of things, we know that screening, prevention, cancer, the same thing applies to head injury.
Yeah, I just couldn't imagine my 9-year-old or 5-year-old playing football and then having to deal with that. And I know I played football growing up. I played a lot of hockey for 20 years. And so somehow managed, I've seen stars a couple of times, but I managed to luck out from that. But you're right. Mental health is super important. It's something that obviously needs to be taken care of. It's the same thing with these players. I mean, some of these players that played in the past, the concussions that happened in the league, getting involved in all that stuff. I mean, that's a story for a different day. But I mean, you've seen the effects of the concussions back then coming back to I mean, I don't want to say necessarily haunt them, but there's just some fallout from that. Nick,
John,
go ahead.
On that piece, I think that the important corollary there is that I think it was occurring all along and we didn't know it. Yeah. I mean, maybe you read about someone committing suicide, an ex-player committing suicide, and suddenly it was like, oh, this person had a history of concussions, head injuries, other issues obviously can play into it. But the players now, when you talk to them, and whether they're retired for 1 year or 10 years, they tell you, even if they didn't have the quote unquote classic concussion, they're struggling with issues related to that pugilist syndrome, we call it, with the same thing that a lot of the boxers and the fighters are seeing. So the fact that mental health is on the tip of everyone's tongue now is good, because it does bring this problem to light, and I think it does allow us to have that discussion. We realize now mistakes were made in terms of how we were handling this problem, and I think because of that, we'll do better moving forward.
No, I appreciate you interrupting to say that. That's definitely super important. I mean, it's a big deal. Needs to be talked about, awareness, and I love how the light helmets is bringing more awareness. Nick, the floor is yours. Anything that you want to say before we kind of wrap up and get out of here?
Yeah, and this just expands on what Tal had to say. There's a balance of, you have these young men and women that are playing these sports. Women's soccer is one of the most concussed sports in the United States in terms of the raw number of concussions. No headgear's worn whatsoever. And, is that a mistake? I think it is. Should the kids be able to play the sport? Absolutely. But should we be spending time, money, research to ensure that, hey, there's some adequate testing for this equipment? Virginia Tech does a great job of testing soccer headgear, hockey headgear, football headgear. People look at the NFL test and they think that test is the end-all be-all if you have a 9-year-old playing. Well, Tariq Hill running at 23 miles an hour, hitting DK Metcalf at 230 pounds running 22 miles an hour, that impact will never happen to that young player other than if they're driving with their mom on the way to the game. So the helmet structure is different. The type of helmet is different. The protection is different. The weight is different. So one of the things we need to do a better job on is educating based on the level of play, what type of helmet and headgear is best related to the impacts that occur for that level of play. And Fitment is critical. Hydration is critical. Diagnosis of concussion is critical. But there's so many benefits to these sports. We need to let the kids play. We saw so many young people struggle after COVID because they weren't allowed to play sports. And the interaction of these young people really builds them for the next chapters in their life, whether they're at work or in a family. But there's a delicate balance of letting them participate, having them participate, encouraging them, and offering optimal safety with the equipment and technology and diagnostic tools that we have. And, guys like Talvet understand this, that are willing to go and jump on an interview like this, talk about this publicly. It's critical. And, it takes courage to come out with a new technology, but it even takes more courage when you are in the medical field to come out and talk about these different topics. And you covering it today on your show, and parents watching this is also extremely important.
Absolutely. Dr. David, same thing. Floor is yours. Anything that you want to add to the discussion that we've had, which has been fantastic, guys. I really appreciate the time.
Not really. I mean, I think that we've covered the highlights. I'm delighted to see how popular this topic has gotten. Talking about it, bringing it to light, I think is going to be part of the solution. Companies like Light that are helping us figure out how to improve the equipment that we're using and reduce those modifiable risk factors. Rule changes that are being made in the league. I mean, I think everything is moving in the direction that it should be, and we just need to stay vigilant, look at the data, look at the science, and protect our players and our colleagues.
Absolutely. It's all about the player safety. And guys, if you haven't seen the article, definitely go to saints.media, check it out. We took all the stories talking about the Saints and just kind of them being one of the 14 teams to jump on the bandwagon as far as being able to test and trial these light helmets. So be sure to check that out. Nick Esayian, I really appreciate your time. Dr. Tal David, I really appreciate both of your times. Guys, I wish you the best. Thanks so much for the time today, and I hope you guys have a great week. And hope to talk to you again down the line.
Sounds great, John. Much appreciated, Tal. Thanks for joining us.
I enjoyed it, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.